He mocked the janitor without imagining that the millionaire who owned the company was him. That's the first thing you need to know. The sneer, the careless words, the laughter that echoed down the polished hallways. It all landed on the janitor like stones. And yet, there was a silence in his eyes, a tired gaze full of wisdom that no one bothered to understand. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're sweeping a hallway, checking the cameras, or locking the building doors for the night. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will shake your heart. In the towering glass cathedral of Manhattan's financial district, where fortunes are made and lost with the click of a mouse, stood the Morrison Tower, a 40-story monument to American capitalism. Its marble lobby gleamed like a palace floor, reflecting the hurried footsteps of traders carrying briefcases worth more than most people's homes. The scent of expensive cologne mixed with the sterile air conditioning, creating an atmosphere of cold prosperity that seemed to whisper, "Only the worthy belong here." But beneath this symphony of success, almost invisible among the polished surfaces and designer suits, moved a figure that most eyes simply refused to see. Henry Washington, 62 years old, with calloused hands and graying temples, arrived every morning at exactly 5 o'clock. His uniform was always impeccable, navy blue pants pressed to perfection, a shirt that smelled of industrial detergent, and shoes that had walked these halls for over a decade. Henry's routine was a quiet ballet of efficiency. He would unlock the service elevator with his worn key ring, the metallic jingle echoing softly in the pre-dawn silence. First, he'd check the security monitors in the basement, 36 screens showing every corner of the building, every shadow, every movement. Then, floor by floor, he would begin his ascent through the empire of glass and steel, carrying his cart filled with cleaning supplies that cost less than what some executives spent on lunch. The irony was profound and heartbreaking. While Wall Street analysts upstairs debated cryptocurrency investments and stock market fluctuations that could move millions of dollars in seconds, Henry moved through their world like a ghost. He knew every corner of that building better than its own architects. He remembered which elevator button stuck on rainy days, which office window needed an extra turn to close properly, and exactly how many steps it took from the lobby to the 41st floor executive suite. But what Henry possessed that no amount of money could buy was something far more valuable than all the Bitcoin wallets and investment portfolios combined: the ability to see truth. In his years of silent observation, he had developed an almost supernatural capacity to read people. A nervous glance, a hushed phone conversation, the way someone's hands trembled when they thought no one was watching. Henry cataloged it all in his extraordinary memory. The executives would brush past him in the hallways, their Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble with an arrogance that seemed to announce their net worth with every step. They spoke of their properties in the Hamptons, their children's private school tuitions, their weekend trips to Martha's Vineyard. To them, Henry was simply part of the building's infrastructure, as essential and as invisible as the heating system or the building's Wi-Fi network. Kyle Morrison, the company's rising young executive and grandson of the building's founder, was perhaps the worst of them all. At 32, with his Harvard MBA and family connections, Kyle moved through the halls like he owned them, which, in many ways, he expected to someday. His suits were custom-tailored, his Rolex caught the light with every gesture, and his confidence was the kind that comes not from achievement, but from the certainty that the world owes you everything. Every morning, Kyle would stride through the lobby with his phone pressed to his ear, discussing multi-million-dollar deals in a voice loud enough to ensure everyone heard. "Tell the Shanghai office that our cryptocurrency assets are performing beyond projections," he would say, as Henry wiped down nearby surfaces, "and make sure the board knows our stock options are up 12% this quarter." Kyle's favorite target for his casual cruelty was, of course, Henry. It started small, a dismissive wave when Henry greeted him, an exaggerated sigh when the janitor's cart was briefly in his path. But gradually, as Kyle's sense of entitlement grew, so did his contempt for the man who kept his world clean and orderly. The other employees took their cues from Kyle. If the boss's grandson treated the janitor like furniture, then that must be his value. Sarah, the sharp financial analyst, would discuss her investment portfolio while Henry emptied her trash, never once acknowledging his presence. Mike from accounting would complain loudly about his tax burdens while Henry mopped the floors around his desk, as if the janitor were deaf as well as invisible. But Henry heard everything. He absorbed every whispered conversation about insider trading, every hushed discussion about cooking the books, every nervous phone call about hiding assets from regulatory inspections. His memory was like a vast filing cabinet, organizing and storing every piece of information that floated through those hallways. In the evenings, Henry would return to his modest apartment in Queens, a one-bedroom walk-up that cost more than it should, but was home nonetheless. He would sit by his window, looking out at the Manhattan skyline, the lights of the financial district twinkling like stars. From his kitchen table, he could see the Morrison Tower, its upper floors glowing against the night sky. Sometimes his neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, would knock on his door with a plate of rice and beans, concerned that he looked too thin, too tired. She was one of the few people who saw Henry as a human being rather than a function. "Mijo," she would say in her gentle Puerto Rican accent, "you work too hard for people who don't appreciate you." Henry would smile and thank her, but he never complained. Complaining, he believed, was for people who had given up hope. What Mrs. Rodriguez didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Henry's modest apartment contained something extraordinary. Hidden behind a loose baseboard in his bedroom closet was a collection of documents that would have made Kyle's Harvard professors weep with admiration. Financial records, corporate bylaws, stock certificates, and investment portfolios that traced back decades. These weren't stolen documents. They were Henry's own records, carefully maintained and updated, representing a fortune that most of Wall Street could only dream of. You see, Henry Washington wasn't just the janitor of Morrison Tower. He was its true owner. Every morning, as he unlocked that service elevator, he was entering his own building, cleaning his own offices, watching over his own empire. The tired janitor in the navy blue uniform was the mysterious investor whose holding company had quietly purchased Morrison Tower and dozens of other properties throughout Manhattan over the past 20 years. But Henry had chosen invisibility for a reason that went beyond money, beyond power, beyond the simple satisfaction of watching karma work. He wanted to understand the true character of the people who worked in his building. He wanted to see how they treated those they considered beneath them when they thought no consequences existed. The weight of this secret pressed down on Henry's shoulders every day as he endured Kyle's casual insults and the thoughtless dismissals of people who wouldn't exist in that building without his generosity. But patience, Henry had learned over 6 decades of life, was the most undervalued currency in America. While others invested in stocks and bonds, Henry had invested in the slow, steady accumulation of truth. Every morning, as dawn broke over Manhattan and Henry began his quiet ascent through the floors of Morrison Tower, he carried with him not just cleaning supplies, but the power to change everything. He was the silent witness to his own empire, the invisible king in his own castle, waiting for the right moment to reveal a truth that would shake the foundations of everything Kyle Morrison thought he knew about power, respect, and the real meaning of wealth. And that moment was coming sooner than anyone could imagine. On a Tuesday morning in late October, when the autumn air carried the bite of approaching winter through Manhattan's steel canyons, Henry arrived at Morrison Tower to find the building buzzing with unusual energy. The lobby was filled with men in expensive suits, not the usual executives, but outsiders whose presence suggested something significant was happening. Henry recognized the signs immediately: federal investigators, their cheap suits and serious expressions marking them as distinctly different from the Wall Street peacocks who usually inhabited these halls. Henry went about his morning routine with his characteristic calm, but his senses were heightened. As he polished the brass fixtures in the elevator, he listened to fragments of worried conversations. "The SEC is asking questions about our cryptocurrency transactions," whispered Sarah, the financial analyst, to her colleague. "Apparently someone tipped them off about irregularities in our quarterly reports." In the executive suite on the 41st floor, Kyle Morrison was pacing behind his mahogany desk like a caged animal. His custom suit, which usually fit him like armor, now seemed to hang awkwardly on his tense frame. The Rolex on his wrist caught the morning light, but instead of projecting success, it now seemed to mock him with its excessive value. Henry entered Kyle's office to empty the trash, moving with his usual quiet efficiency. Kyle barely glanced at him, too absorbed in a heated phone conversation with what sounded like the company's legal team. "I don't care what it costs," Kyle was saying, his voice carrying the sharp edge of desperation. "Get me the best securities attorney in New York. My family's entire net worth is tied up in this company." As Henry worked, he noticed something that would have escaped the attention of someone less observant. Kyle's hands were trembling slightly as he shuffled through papers on his desk. Sweat beads had formed on his forehead despite the office's perfect climate control. The young executive who had spent years mocking the janitor's low status was now facing the possibility of losing everything that defined his identity. But Henry felt no satisfaction in Kyle's fear. Instead, he felt something more complex, a mixture of sadness for the young man's wasted opportunities and determination to ensure that justice, when it came, would be complete and undeniable. Over the following days, the investigation intensified. Federal agents interviewed employees, examined computer records, and requested documents dating back years. The building that had once hummed with confident discussions of profit margins and investment returns now echoed with whispered fears and nervous speculation. Kyle's behavior toward Henry became even more erratic. Sometimes he would snap at the janitor for minor infractions, moving too slowly, making too much noise with his cart, taking too long in the office. Other times he seemed not to see Henry at all, staring out his window at the Manhattan skyline with the hollow expression of a man watching his world collapse. "Do you have any idea how much money is at stake here?" Kyle shouted at Henry one afternoon, apparently forgetting that he was addressing someone he considered mentally inferior. Henry had been quietly replacing the water in Kyle's executive plants when the young man's frustration finally boiled over. "Millions of dollars, properties, investments, cryptocurrency portfolios worth more than you'll ever see in your pathetic life." Henry looked up from his work, meeting Kyle's eyes for perhaps the first time in years. In that moment, Kyle saw something that made him pause, not the dull acceptance he expected, but a depth of understanding that seemed almost supernatural. It was as if the janitor was looking not just at Kyle, but through him, seeing something that Kyle himself couldn't recognize. "Sorry, Mr. Morrison," Henry said quietly, his voice carrying a dignity that somehow made Kyle feel smaller rather than larger. "I'll be more careful." But as Henry returned to his work, Kyle found himself unable to shake the image of those eyes. Tired, yes, but also infinitely patient, as if they had seen this story play out countless times before and knew exactly how it would end. The investigation revealed what Henry had observed over years of silent watching, a complex web of financial misconduct that went far beyond simple accounting errors. Kyle and several other executives had been manipulating cryptocurrency investments, hiding losses from shareholders, and using company funds for personal expenses that they disguised as business costs. The scheme was sophisticated, involving offshore accounts and shell companies that should have been impossible for federal investigators to trace. But someone had provided them with a roadmap. Anonymous tips had been arriving at the SEC for months, each one containing precisely the information needed to uncover the next layer of the conspiracy. Bank records that should have been confidential, email communications that had been supposedly deleted, investment documents that existed in only one or two copies. Kyle became obsessed with discovering the identity of the whistleblower. He hired private investigators, installed additional security cameras, and even began questioning employees about their loyalty to the company. His paranoia grew with each federal subpoena, each frozen asset, each news article that described his family's business empire as a house of cards built on decades of financial deception. The irony was exquisite. Kyle was searching desperately for his betrayer, never imagining that the man he mocked daily possessed not only the information to destroy him, but also the legal authority to do so. Henry continued his quiet work, watching Kyle's increasing desperation with the same patient attention he gave to everything else. 3 weeks after the investigation began, the federal agents arrested Kyle Morrison on charges of securities fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The scene was almost theatrical in its justice. Kyle, still wearing his $1,000 suit, was led out of Morrison Tower in handcuffs while Henry mopped the marble floors of the lobby. As the handcuffs clicked shut, Kyle's eyes met Henry's one final time. In that moment, perhaps for the first time in his privileged life, Kyle Morrison saw the janitor not as an object to be dismissed, but as a human being whose dignity he had trampled for years. The recognition came too late to change anything, but it was there nonetheless, a flicker of understanding that pierced through decades of entitled blindness. The building fell silent after Kyle's arrest, but it was a different kind of silence than Henry was used to. This wasn't the comfortable quiet of early morning routines or late evening cleaning. This was the heavy silence of a world turned upside down, of assumptions shattered and foundations cracked. Henry continued his work as if nothing had changed, but inside, he was preparing for the most difficult part of his long patience, the revelation of truth. The morning after Kyle's arrest, Henry Washington did something he had never done in his 12 years at Morrison Tower. He took the elevator to the 42nd floor. This was the executive boardroom level, a sanctum he had only seen through security cameras in the basement. As the elevator doors opened, he stepped into a world of polished conference tables, leather chairs that cost more than most cars, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a god's-eye view of Manhattan. The emergency board meeting was already in session. Through the glass walls of the conference room, Henry could see a dozen men and women in expensive suits, their faces grave as they discussed the company's future. Legal documents were scattered across the mahogany table like fallen leaves, and the smell of fear was as palpable as the coffee that sat cooling in forgotten cups. Henry knocked gently on the conference room door. The conversation inside stopped abruptly as 12 pairs of eyes turned toward him with expressions ranging from confusion to annoyance. Who was this janitor? And why was he interrupting the most important board meeting in the company's history? "Excuse me," Henry said, his voice carrying across the room with surprising authority. "My name is Henry Washington, and I believe you've been looking for me." The confusion in the room deepened. Thomas Morrison, Kyle's grandfather and the company's ostensible founder, leaned forward in his chair. At 84, he still carried himself with the bearing of a man accustomed to command, though the recent events had clearly taken their toll on his legendary composure. "I'm sorry," Thomas said, his voice carrying the distinctive accent of old Manhattan money, "but I think there's been some mistake. We're in the middle of a very important meeting, and—" Henry reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a manila envelope that looked ordinary enough, but which contained documents that would fundamentally alter everyone's understanding of reality. He placed it gently on the conference table, the sound of paper against wood somehow more significant than any words that had been spoken. 23 years ago, Henry began, his voice steady and clear, I purchased Morrison Tower and the company that bears your family's name through a series of holding companies and investment partnerships. The documentation is all there: stock certificates, transfer agreements, quarterly dividend reports. Everything legal, everything properly recorded with the appropriate regulatory agencies. The silence in the room was absolute. Thomas Morrison's face had gone pale, and his hands gripped the arms of his leather chair, as if the world had begun to spin beneath him. The other board members stared at the envelope as if it contained a bomb rather than financial documents. "That's impossible," whispered Janet Wheeler, the company's chief financial officer. "We've seen all the ownership records. The Morrison family has controlled this company for over half a century." Henry nodded with the patience of a teacher addressing confused students. "The Morrison family has managed the company for over half a century," he corrected gently. "But ownership and management are two very different things, as I'm sure you all understand better than most." He opened the envelope and spread the documents across the table with practiced efficiency. Stock certificates bearing dates from decades past, signed transfer agreements, incorporation papers for holding companies with names like Queensbridge Holdings and Metropolitan Asset Management. Each document bore official seals and registration numbers that could be easily verified. But it was the final document that caused Thomas Morrison to close his eyes and lean back in his chair as if he had been struck. It was a letter, handwritten on Morrison Company letterhead, dated 23 years ago and signed by Thomas himself. "Mr. Washington," the letter read, "I am pleased to accept your generous offer to purchase Morrison Tower and assume controlling interest in our company. Your terms are more than fair, and your commitment to maintaining our employees and preserving our reputation gives me confidence that the Morrison legacy will continue to flourish under your stewardship." Henry's voice filled the stunned silence. "You were facing bankruptcy, Mr. Morrison. The savings and loan crisis had wiped out your construction loans, and you were 3 months away from losing everything your grandfather had built. I offered you a way to save your company and your employees' jobs with the understanding that you would continue to manage operations while I remained a silent partner." Thomas Morrison opened his eyes, and for the first time looked directly at Henry, not as a janitor, but as the man who had saved his life's work. "But why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you stay hidden? Why did you work as a janitor in your own building?" Henry walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the Manhattan skyline, the city that had given him everything and taken so much in return. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of decades of careful observation and patient understanding. "Because I wanted to know who you all really were," he said simply. "Money changes people, Mr. Morrison. It makes some generous and wise, but it makes others cruel and small. I wanted to see how my employees treated those they thought were powerless. I wanted to understand whether the people I was trusting with my investment deserved that trust." He turned back to face the room, and his eyes moved from face to face, cataloging the expressions of shock, shame, and dawning understanding. Some of these people had treated him with casual dismissal over the years. Others had been kind, offering small courtesies that they thought went unnoticed. "For 12 years, Henry continued, I have watched this company from the inside. I have seen the shortcuts you've taken, the corners you've cut, the people you've dismissed as unworthy of basic human respect. And I have also seen the dedication of employees who work late into the night, who care about quality, who treat everyone with dignity regardless of their position in the corporate hierarchy." Janet Wheeler found her voice first. "The federal investigation," she said, understanding dawning in her voice. "You were the source. You provided the evidence that brought down Kyle." Henry nodded. "Kyle Morrison represented everything I had hoped this company would never become. Entitled, cruel, corrupt. He built his wealth through deception and maintained his position through the systematic humiliation of others. The evidence I provided to federal investigators was gathered over years of careful observation." Thomas Morrison's voice cracked as he spoke. "My grandson, what will happen to him?" "That will be determined by the courts," Henry replied with neither satisfaction nor cruelty. "But I suspect Kyle will learn things about himself in prison that a lifetime of privilege never taught him. Sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the paper of consequence." The room remained silent as the magnitude of the revelation settled over everyone present. The janitor they had ignored for years, whose existence they had barely acknowledged, was not only their boss, but also the man who held their professional futures in his calloused hands. But Henry's next words surprised them even more. "I'm not here to fire anyone or shut down the company," he said, returning to his seat at the conference table as if he had attended board meetings there for years. "I'm here to offer you all a choice. You can continue working for Morris & Company under new management, my management, with a renewed commitment to treating every employee with dignity and respect. Or you can pursue opportunities elsewhere with my personal recommendation and a generous severance package." He paused, studying their faces with the same careful attention he had given to security monitors in the basement for over a decade. "But if you choose to stay, understand that this company will operate by different principles going forward. Every employee, from the newest intern to the most senior executive, will be treated as a valuable human being deserving of respect. Salaries will be fair, benefits will be comprehensive, and no one will ever again be mocked or dismissed because of their position or the work they do." Sarah Martinez, the financial analyst who had always been polite to Henry during his cleaning rounds, raised her hand tentatively. "Mr. Washington," she said, her voice uncertain, "what happens now? How do we move forward from here?" Henry smiled, the first genuine smile many of them had ever seen from him. It transformed his entire face, revealing the kindness that had always been there, hidden beneath years of careful observation and patient endurance. "We move forward by remembering that every person in this building, from the executive suite to the mailroom, is part of something larger than themselves," he said. "We remember that true wealth isn't measured in stock options or cryptocurrency portfolios, but in the positive impact we have on each other's lives. And we remember that nobody, absolutely nobody, is invisible." As the meeting concluded and the board members filed out, many of them stopping to apologize to Henry for years of thoughtless behavior, Thomas Morrison remained behind. The old man sat in his leather chair, staring at the documents scattered across the table, as if they were artifacts from an archaeological dig of his own failure. "Henry," he said finally, using the janitor's first name for perhaps the first time in 12 years. "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you an explanation for how badly I failed as a leader." Henry gathered the documents back into their envelope, his movements deliberate and calm. "Mr. Morrison," he said, "you gave me something more valuable than any apology could be. You gave me the opportunity to understand that true character isn't revealed in moments of success, but in how we treat others when we think no one important is watching." He stood to leave, then turned back one final time. "Your grandson isn't an evil person, Thomas. He's a product of a system that taught him that his worth was measured by his ability to make others feel small. Prison might be the first honest education he's ever received." As Henry left the boardroom and returned to the service elevator, he carried with him not the satisfaction of revenge, but the deeper contentment that comes from justice served with wisdom and mercy. The invisible man had finally stepped into the light, but he had done so not to blind others with his power, but to illuminate a better path forward. The transformation of Morris & Company didn't happen overnight, but it happened with the steady persistence that characterized everything Henry Washington did. Within 6 months, the company's culture had changed so dramatically that it became a case study in business schools across the country. The first change was practical. Every employee, regardless of position, was required to spend 1 day each quarter working alongside the building's maintenance staff. Executives found themselves emptying trash cans and mopping floors, while administrative assistants learned to repair broken elevators and replace air conditioning filters. The program was called Foundation Days, and it quickly became one of the most requested benefits packages for new employees. Sarah Martinez, who had been promoted to Chief Financial Officer after Janet Wheeler's resignation, described the program to a Wall Street Journal reporter. You can't truly understand the value of work until you've done every kind of work. Our executives make better decisions now because they understand the true cost of those decisions on every employee in the building. The second change was philosophical. Henry instituted what he called dignity policies, a comprehensive framework that guaranteed every employee would be treated with respect regardless of their role. Casual cruelty, which had once been dismissed as office culture, became grounds for immediate termination. The policy was tested early when a junior executive made a disparaging comment about the cleaning staff during a team meeting. He was fired that afternoon, with Henry personally delivering the termination notice. "We have 42 floors in this building," Henry told the dismissed executive, "but there isn't room for even one person who believes that their job title gives them permission to diminish another human being." The third change was financial. Henry restructured the company's compensation system to ensure that every employee, from mailroom clerks to senior partners, earned a living wage that reflected the actual cost of living in Manhattan. He also instituted profit-sharing bonuses that extended to every employee, including part-time and contract workers. The financial press initially criticized these changes as economically unsound, predicting that Morrison Company would lose its competitive edge in the ruthless world of Manhattan real estate and investment management. But the opposite happened. Employee satisfaction soared, productivity increased, and the company began attracting top talent from competitors who couldn't match Morrison's reputation for ethical treatment of workers. Henry himself continued to maintain a modest lifestyle, though he no longer worked as a janitor. He kept his apartment in Queens, continued to take the subway to work, and still arrived every morning at exactly 5 o'clock, not to clean, but to walk through the building and ensure that his vision of dignity and respect was being maintained. His morning walks became legendary among employees. He would stop at every floor, chat with early arrivals, and make himself available for anyone who needed to discuss concerns or suggestions. These weren't formal meetings or scheduled appointments. They were conversations between human beings who had learned to see each other clearly. Mrs. Rodriguez, his neighbor in Queens, noticed the change in Henry immediately. "Mijo," she said over their weekly dinner of rice and beans, "you look different. Lighter somehow, like you've been carrying something heavy and finally put it down." Henry smiled and nodded. "I've been carrying a secret for a very long time, Mrs. Rodriguez, and secrets, even good ones, get heavy after a while." The impact of Henry's revelation extended far beyond Morrison Company. Word spread through Manhattan's business community about the janitor who turned out to be a millionaire, and more importantly, about the principles he implemented after revealing his true identity. Other companies began examining their own cultures, asking difficult questions about how they treated their lowest-paid employees. A year after Henry's revelation, Kyle Morrison was released from federal prison after serving his sentence for securities fraud. He was a different man than the arrogant executive who had been led away in handcuffs, quieter, more thoughtful, with a kind of humility that only comes from having everything you thought defined you stripped away. Kyle requested a meeting with Henry, and they met in a small coffee shop in Queens, far from the marble and glass world where their confrontation had begun. Kyle looked older than his years, wearing an inexpensive suit and carrying himself with the careful posture of someone who had learned to be grateful for simple freedoms. "I owe you an apology," Kyle said without preamble, his voice carrying none of its former arrogance. "Not just for how I treated you personally, but for what I became. Prison gave me time to think about a lot of things, and mostly about how wrong I was about everything that mattered." Henry studied the young man across from him, seeing echoes of the scared child who must have existed beneath all that entitlement and cruelty. "What will you do now?" he asked gently. Kyle managed a small, self-deprecating smile. "I'm working for a non-profit in Brooklyn that helps ex-convicts find housing and jobs. Turns out having a criminal record teaches you a lot about how society treats people it considers disposable. I make about 1/10 of what I used to make, and I've never been happier with my work." They talked for 2 hours, and when they parted, Henry offered Kyle something unexpected. "If you ever want to come back to Morrison Company," he said, "there will always be a place for you. But you'd start in the mailroom like everyone else, and you'd have to earn every promotion through merit and character." Kyle nodded, understanding that this wasn't just a job offer, it was an invitation to redemption. "Thank you," he said simply. "Maybe someday I'll be ready for that chance." As Henry walked back to his apartment that evening, the lights of Manhattan twinkling in the distance, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought him from invisible janitor to visible leader. The most profound change wasn't in how others saw him, but in how he had learned to use his visibility responsibly. Power, Henry had discovered, wasn't about making others feel small. It was about creating space for everyone to feel valued. True wealth wasn't measured in stock portfolios or cryptocurrency investments, but in the number of lives you could positively impact. And dignity wasn't something you earned through job titles or salary figures. It was something you either recognized in others or revealed your own lack thereof. 3 years had passed since that October morning when federal agents arrested Kyle Morrison, and Morrison Tower had become something entirely different from what Henry had found when he first walked through its marble lobby with his cart and his careful silence. The building still gleamed with prosperity, but now it also hummed with something rarer and more valuable: genuine respect between human beings. Henry, now 65, had settled into his role as company president with the same quiet competence he had brought to mopping floors and emptying trash cans. His office was on the 42nd floor, in the space that had once housed the boardroom where his identity was revealed, but he spent most of his time walking through the building, talking with employees, and ensuring that the culture of dignity he had worked so hard to establish continued to flourish. The company had prospered beyond anyone's expectations. Employee retention was the highest in the industry. Productivity had increased by 30%, and Morrison Company had been featured on the cover of Forbes magazine as America's most ethical employer. The article's headline read, "The Janitor Who Became CEO and Changed Everything." But for Henry, the real measure of success wasn't found in financial reports or magazine articles. It was found in small moments that would have been invisible to most people, but which meant everything to a man who had spent 12 years being invisible himself. It was found in the way Maria, the night security guard, now greeted every employee by name instead of just nodding silently as they passed. It was found in the company-wide policy that no one could start a meeting until all participants, regardless of their role, had been properly introduced and acknowledged. It was found in the fact that the executive dining room had been converted into a common cafeteria where CEOs and custodians ate at the same tables and engaged in conversations that would have been unthinkable in the old Morrison Company. Most importantly, it was found in the stories that employees told about their work. Instead of complaining about their jobs, they talked about their purpose. Instead of gossiping about office politics, they shared ideas for improving processes and helping colleagues. The building that had once echoed with the hollow laughter of cruelty now resonated with the authentic sounds of people who felt valued and respected. On a Thursday evening in late November, as Henry was preparing to leave the office, he received a call that would provide the perfect ending to his extraordinary journey. It was from the MacArthur Foundation, informing him that he had been selected as a recipient of a Genius Grant for his innovative approaches to ethical business leadership and workplace dignity. The caller, a foundation executive, explained breathlessly that Henry's transformation of Morrison Company had sparked a nationwide movement toward more humane corporate cultures. "Mr. Washington," she said, "what you've accomplished represents a fundamental shift in how America thinks about the relationship between work and human dignity." Henry listened politely, then asked, "Does this come with any money?" When told that the grant included a substantial cash award, he chuckled softly. "Well, I know exactly what to do with that." The next morning, Henry announced that the entire MacArthur grant would be used to establish the Invisible Heroes Fund, a foundation that would provide scholarships, small business loans, and emergency assistance to janitors, security guards, maintenance workers, and other service employees throughout New York City. Every day, Henry explained to the gathered employees, millions of people go to work in jobs that others consider unimportant. They clean offices after everyone else goes home. They guard buildings while the city sleeps. They fix the things that break and maintain the systems that everyone else takes for granted. They are the invisible heroes who make all our other work possible. He paused, looking around at faces that had become family to him over the years. This fund will help ensure that being invisible doesn't mean being forgotten, and that every person who works hard to support their family has the opportunity to build something better. The announcement was met with standing ovation that lasted nearly 10 minutes, but the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source, a letter that arrived the following week, postmarked from Brooklyn, and signed simply K.M. "Dear Mr. Washington," the letter read, "I saw the news about your MacArthur grant and the Invisible Heroes Fund. I wanted you to know that your example hasn't just changed Morris & Company. It's changing people like me who needed to learn what real leadership looks like. I've been working with formerly incarcerated individuals for 2 years now, and I think I'm finally ready to take you up on that offer to come back and start in the mailroom. Not because I need a job, but because I want to be part of what you're building. I understand now that earning respect is a process, not a birthright." Henry smiled as he read Kyle's letter, remembering the arrogant young man who had once mocked him in these same hallways. Redemption, like dignity, was available to everyone willing to do the work required to earn it. As winter settled over Manhattan and the lights in Morrison Tower began to twinkle like stars against the early darkness, Henry would sometimes stand at his office window and reflect on the strange path that had brought him to this moment. He thought about all the people who had walked past him during his years of invisibility, never imagining that their janitor was also their guardian angel. He thought about Mrs. Rodriguez, who still cooked dinner for him every Sunday, and who had never been surprised by his revelation. "Mijo," she had said when he told her the truth, "I always knew you were something special. You can tell by how a person treats children and animals, and people who can't do anything for them. Money doesn't make someone important. Kindness does." Most of all, he thought about the thousands of invisible workers throughout the city who were still waiting for someone to see them, to acknowledge their contributions, to recognize their humanity. The Invisible Heroes Fund was just the beginning of what Henry hoped would be a much larger movement toward treating all work as valuable and all workers as deserving of dignity. Standing at his window on that winter evening, Henry Washington, former janitor, current CEO, and eternal believer in the power of human dignity, made a quiet promise to himself and to all the invisible heroes still waiting to be seen. The work wasn't finished. It was just beginning. But Henry's story had already begun to ripple outward in ways he could never have anticipated. 6 months after the establishment of the Invisible Heroes Fund, he received an unexpected visitor in his office. Carmen Santos, a young woman in her 20s with calloused hands and tired eyes that reminded Henry of his own younger self, sat across from his desk clutching a manila folder. "Mr. Washington," she began, her voice carrying a slight Spanish accent, "I read about you in the newspaper, about how you were a janitor who owned the building. I think I might be in a similar situation." Henry leaned forward, intrigued. Carmen explained that she had been working as a night cleaner at a struggling tech startup in Brooklyn for 3 years. The company was on the verge of bankruptcy, and the employees, bright young programmers and designers, were facing unemployment. What they didn't know was that Carmen had been quietly buying shares in the company with her savings, using her late father's investment account. "My father, he cleaned offices for 40 years, Carmen explained, tears welling in her eyes. But at night, he studied the stock market. He taught me that sometimes the best investments are in companies that everybody else thinks are worthless. I've been watching this company, learning about their technology, and I believe in what they're trying to do. She opened her folder and showed Henry the documents, stock certificates that proved she now owned 60% of the failing startup. The employees, they treat me like I'm invisible, just like they treated you. But Mr. Washington, I don't know what to do with this power. How do I reveal the truth without destroying their spirits? How do I help them see that their janitor believed in them when no one else would? Henry spent the next 2 hours with Carmen, sharing the wisdom he had gained through his own journey. He explained the importance of timing, the delicate balance between justice and mercy, and the responsibility that comes with hidden power. Most importantly, he helped her understand that her revelation could be a gift rather than a curse if handled with care and intention. The question isn't whether to reveal the truth, Henry told her. The question is how to reveal it in a way that lifts everyone up, including yourself. 3 months later, Henry received an invitation to attend a company meeting at Carmen's tech startup. When he arrived at the small Brooklyn office, he found the young employees, programmers, designers, and marketers gathered in a conference room that looked nothing like Morrison Tower's mahogany-paneled boardroom. This was a world of standing desks, whiteboards covered in code, and the kind of creative chaos that signaled innovation rather than tradition. Carmen stood at the front of the room, wearing the same cleaning uniform Henry remembered from his own years of invisibility, but carrying herself with newfound confidence. She had taken Henry's advice about timing and revelation, waiting for the moment when her message would have the greatest positive impact. 3 years ago, Carmen began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. I started working here as a cleaner. And 3 years ago, I started believing in this company when everyone else, including yourselves sometimes, thought we might fail. She walked to the whiteboard and wrote out the company's financial situation, debts, assets, and the grim reality of their circumstances. The room fell silent as the numbers confirmed what everyone had suspected, but no one had wanted to acknowledge. But what you don't know, Carmen continued, is that over these 3 years, someone has been quietly investing in this company. Someone who saw your late-night dedication, who watched you problem-solve with creativity and integrity, who believed that your work was worth supporting even when the market didn't agree. One of the programmers, a young man named David, who had always been polite to Carmen during her cleaning rounds, raised his hand tentatively. Carmen, who is this investor? Are we being bought out by a larger company? Carmen smiled, the same transformative smile Henry had shown his board members years earlier. The investor was me, she said simply. I own 60% of this company, and I'm not here to change anything about how you work or what you create. I'm here to ensure that you have the resources to keep doing what you do best. The silence that followed was different from the stunned quiet Henry had experienced in Morrison Tower's boardroom. This silence was filled not with shame and fear, but with wonder and possibility. These young entrepreneurs had struggled to find investors who understood their vision, and discovery that their cleaner, the person who had watched them work through countless late nights, was their guardian angel, felt like vindication rather than judgment. But Carmen's revelation had a twist that went beyond Henry's original story. I want to offer everyone in this room partnership shares, she announced, not because you need me to succeed, but because your success should belong to all of us who believed in it. The room erupted in questions, congratulations, and the kind of enthusiastic energy that only comes when people realize their dreams are not only possible, but actively being supported by someone who had been watching them with love and faith. Henry watched the scene unfold with profound satisfaction. Carmen had learned the most important lesson of his own journey, that hidden power was most meaningful when it was used to reveal the potential in others rather than simply to expose their flaws. After the meeting, as Henry and Carmen walked through the Brooklyn streets toward the subway station, she asked him the question he had been expecting. Mr. Washington, was it worth it? All those years of being invisible, of letting people underestimate you, of watching them reveal their worst selves. Henry considered the question carefully, watching the evening light reflect off the windows of the buildings around them, buildings that might house other invisible heroes, other hidden guardians, other people whose true worth was waiting to be revealed. "Carmen," he said finally, "invisibility isn't a burden if you choose it with purpose. Those years taught me things about human nature that I could never have learned from a corner office. They showed me that dignity doesn't come from how others see you, but from how clearly you see others. And most importantly, they proved that the most powerful position in any room is often held by the person nobody notices." As they reached the subway entrance, Carmen turned to him one more time. "What's next for you, Mr. Washington? You've transformed your company, established your foundation, inspired people like me to follow your example. Where does your story go from here?" Henry smiled and looked back toward Manhattan, where Morrison Tower's lights were beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. "My story doesn't end, Carmen. It multiplies. Every invisible hero who finds the courage to step into the light, every person who chooses dignity over cruelty, every worker who gets treated with respect instead of dismissal. That's all part of my story now." He paused, then added with the quiet wisdom that had sustained him through years of patient observation. "The most beautiful thing about invisibility is that when you finally become visible, you help others see themselves clearly, too." Over the following months, the story of Carmen's revelation spread through Brooklyn's tech community, just as Henry's story had resonated throughout Manhattan's financial district. But more importantly, it sparked conversations in offices, factories, restaurants, and hospitals across the city about the value of every worker and the importance of treating all labor with dignity. Henry began receiving letters and emails from people around the country who had been inspired by his example. A hospital custodian in Chicago wrote about how doctors had started thanking him for his work after reading about Morrison Company's transformation. A school cafeteria worker in Denver described how teachers now made sure students said please and thank you instead of treating lunch service as an entitlement. But perhaps the most meaningful correspondence came from other invisible owners, people who, like Henry and Carmen, had quietly invested in the companies where they worked in service positions. A security guard who owned shares in the law firm he protected. A restaurant dishwasher who had become a silent partner in the kitchen where he worked. A gas station attendant who had gradually purchased the station where she had pumped gas for 15 years. Henry began organizing monthly meetings for these hidden entrepreneurs, creating a network of support for people who had chosen the challenging path of invisible ownership. The meetings were held not in gleaming conference rooms, but in community centers, public libraries, and neighborhood cafes, spaces that reflected the humble origins and continuing values of their participants. At one particularly memorable gathering, held in a Queens community center just a few blocks from Henry's apartment, nearly 40 invisible owners gathered to share their stories and strategies. The diversity was remarkable. Men and women of various ages and ethnicities, representing industries from technology to manufacturing to healthcare, united by their common experience of being underestimated while holding hidden power. During the meeting, a middle-aged African-American woman named Dorothy Williams shared a story that moved everyone to tears. She had worked as a hospital cleaner for 20 years, witnessing the daily miracles and tragedies of healthcare while being treated as part of the invisible infrastructure. When the hospital faced budget cuts that threatened to eliminate patient programs she had watched change lives, Dorothy revealed that she had been investing her modest salary in hospital bonds and medical equipment companies for 2 decades. "I couldn't let them shut down the children's cancer ward," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "I'd seen too many families find hope in those rooms, so I offered to fund the entire program through my investment portfolio." The look on the board of directors' faces when the cleaning lady pulled out financial statements showing she could single-handedly save their budget. It was worth 20 years of being treated like I didn't exist. Stories like Dorothy's reinforced Henry's growing understanding that his experience at Morrison Tower was not unique, but rather part of a larger pattern of invisible heroes using their strategic position and patient accumulation of resources to protect and improve the institutions they serve. As the network of invisible owners grew, Henry began to see the emergence of a new model of capitalism, one based not on extraction and exploitation, but on stewardship and servant leadership. These hidden guardians were proving that sustainable business practices, ethical treatment of workers, and long-term thinking could be more profitable than the short-term aggressive tactics that dominated traditional corporate culture. The movement began attracting attention from business schools and management consultants who wanted to study and understand the invisible owner model. Harvard Business School invited Henry to deliver a guest lecture, which he accepted on the condition that he could bring Carmen and several other invisible owners to participate in the presentation. The lecture hall was packed with MBA students who had read case studies about Morrison Company's transformation, but had never heard directly from the janitor who had engineered it. Henry stood at the podium wearing a simple black suit, expensive enough to command respect in the academic setting, but modest enough to reflect his continued commitment to humility. "You've studied the numbers," Henry began, looking out at the sea of eager faces. "You know that companies with inclusive cultures and ethical practices outperform their competitors in productivity, innovation, and long-term profitability. What you might not understand is why this happens, and how invisible leadership creates sustainable transformation." He clicked to the first slide of his presentation, a photograph of Morrison Tower's marble lobby gleaming with the cold prosperity that had once defined its character. The image showed executives in expensive suits hurrying past, their faces focused on phones and documents, blind to the human beings who maintain their environment. "Traditional leadership models assume that power flows from the top down," Henry continued. "Executives make decisions, managers implement them, and workers execute them. This model creates efficiency in the short term, but it also creates blindness. Leaders who are insulated from the real experience of work make decisions based on incomplete information." The next slide showed the same lobby after Morrison Company's transformation. The same marble floors and gleaming surfaces, but now filled with people engaged in conversation with each other, executives and maintenance staff sharing the same space with mutual respect and acknowledgement. "Invisible leadership inverts this model," Henry explained. "Those at the bottom of the traditional hierarchy often have the clearest view of how systems actually work. They see waste that executives miss. They understand customer needs that market research overlooks. They witness the human cost of policy decisions that look good on spreadsheets but fail in practice." A student raised her hand. "But Mr. Washington, isn't your model dependent on extraordinary circumstances? How many janitors can actually afford to buy the companies where they work? Isn't this more of an inspirational story than a replicable business strategy?" Henry smiled at the question, recognizing the skepticism that had once dismissed his own unlikely journey. "Carmen, would you like to answer that?" Carmen stood and walked to the front of the lecture hall. Still wearing the simple clothes and carrying herself with the quiet confidence Henry remembered from their first meeting. "You're right that not every service worker can buy their company," she said. "But you're wrong if you think ownership is the only form of invisible leadership." She clicked to a new slide showing photographs from companies across the country where invisible leadership principles had been implemented without hidden ownership. The janitor at Morrison Tower happened to be the owner, but the principles he used work regardless of the power structure, listening to all voices, treating every job as valuable, creating cultures of dignity and respect. These strategies transform companies whether they're implemented by secret millionaire janitors or by visible executives who choose to lead with humility. The presentation continued for another hour, with Henry, Carmen, and other invisible owners sharing concrete examples of how their approach had improved everything from employee retention to customer satisfaction to innovation rates. By the end, The skeptical MBA students were taking notes furiously and asking detailed questions about implementation strategies. But the moment that most powerfully illustrated the spread of invisible leadership principles came not during the formal presentation, but during the question and answer session afterward. A young man in the back row raised his hand and stood up, his voice nervous but determined. "Mr. Washington, I need to tell you something," he began. "My father worked as a custodian at this business school for 15 years. I'm here on a scholarship funded by an anonymous donor, and I always assumed it was some wealthy alumnus who wanted to give back. But after hearing your presentation, Dad, if you're watching this online like you promised, I want you to know that I finally understand." The lecture hall fell completely silent as the young man's eyes filled with tears. "I think my father might be an invisible owner too, and I've never been more proud of him or more ashamed of how long it took me to see what was right in front of me." After the Harvard lecture, Henry realized that his story had evolved beyond his own personal journey into something larger and more significant. The invisible owner movement was changing not just individual companies, but the broader conversation about work, dignity, and the relationship between power and responsibility in American capitalism. Media requests began pouring in from news outlets around the world. The BBC wanted to do a documentary about invisible ownership in London's financial district. Japanese business leaders invited Henry to speak about implementing dignity-based management in their corporate culture. A publisher offered him a 7-figure advance for a book about his experiences. Henry accepted some of these opportunities, but he was selective, always ensuring that the focus remained on the principles rather than his personality, and that other invisible owners were included in the conversation. He had no interest in becoming a celebrity. His goal was to normalize the idea that every worker deserved respect, and that businesses operated more successfully when they recognized the value of all their employees. The book, when it was finally published 2 years later, was titled Invisible Heroes: How Hidden Leadership Transforms Companies and Communities. Rather than focusing solely on Henry's story, it profiled dozens of invisible owners and servant leaders from around the world, creating a comprehensive guide for implementing dignity-based management practices in any organization. The book's success surprised everyone, including its publisher. It spent months on bestseller lists, was translated into 17 languages, and became required reading in business schools and leadership programs around the globe. But more importantly, it sparked practical changes in workplace culture across industries and continents. 5 years after Henry's revelation at Morrison Tower, Kyle Morrison returned to New York. His transformation during his years away had been as complete as Henry's own journey from invisible janitor to visible leader. Kyle had completed his prison sentence, earned a degree in social work during his incarceration, and spent 3 years working with homeless veterans in Philadelphia. When Kyle walked into Morrison Tower's lobby for the first time since his arrest, he was wearing clothes that cost 1/10 of his old wardrobe, but carried himself with a dignity he had never possessed in his days of designer suits and arrogant confidence. The marble floors still gleamed, but the atmosphere was entirely different from the cold temple of capitalism he remembered. Employees moved through the space with purpose, but without the frantic desperation that had once characterized the building's energy. Conversations happened between people regardless of their position in the corporate hierarchy. The security desk, once manned by guards who barely acknowledged the existence of most workers, was now staffed by people who knew every employee's name and asked about their families and concerns. Kyle took the elevator to the 42nd floor, where Henry's assistant, a young woman who had started as a part-time receptionist and earned advancement through the merit-based promotion system Henry had instituted, welcomed him with genuine warmth. "Mr. Morrison," she said, using the name that now carried very different associations than it had during his grandfather's era. "Mr. Washington is expecting you. He's very excited about your decision to join our team." Kyle nodded, still adjusting to being treated with kindness rather than the deference or suspicion he had experienced in other contexts. He walked into Henry's office, the same space where he had once paced frantically during the federal investigation, but now transformed into a workspace that reflected its occupants' values of accessibility and humanity. Henry looked up from his desk, where he was reviewing applications for the Invisible Heroes Fund, and smiled broadly. At 68, he carried himself with the serene confidence of a man who had found his true purpose and lived it fully. His hair was completely gray now, and his face showed the lines that come from years of genuine laughter and concern for others. "Kyle," Henry said, standing and extending his hand, not with the wariness of a former adversary, but with the warmth of a mentor welcoming a student. "Welcome home." They sat together in the comfortable chairs Henry had placed by his office windows, looking out at the Manhattan skyline that had witnessed both of their transformations. For a moment, neither spoke, both reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this point. "Mr. Washington," Kyle said finally, his voice carrying none of the arrogance that had once defined his speech, "I want you to know that I understand what starting in the mailroom means. It's not punishment, it's education. I need to learn this company from the ground up, the way you did. I need to understand what work means to people who don't have trust funds to fall back on." Henry nodded, studying the young man who had once been his tormentor and was now seeking to become his student. "Kyle, the mailroom is just the beginning. If you're truly committed to this path, you'll spend time in every department, learning every job, understanding how each person contributes to our success. You'll work security shifts, spend time with the cleaning crew, shadow our IT support team. You'll earn your advancement through merit and character, not through your last name." "I understand," Kyle replied, "and I want you to know that I'm not doing this to reclaim some version of my old life. I'm a different person now. Prison taught me things about myself that I never would have learned in a corner office. I want to be part of what you've built here, but only if I can contribute something valuable." Henry leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. "Kyle, I'm going to be honest with you. Not everyone in this building will be comfortable with your return. Some people remember how you treated them, the casual cruelty you showed to anyone you considered beneath you. You'll have to prove yourself not just to me, but to every person you once dismissed as unworthy of basic respect." Kyle's eyes showed a flash of the pain he had learned to carry with him, not the self-pity of someone who felt sorry for himself, but the deeper ache that comes from truly understanding the harm you've caused others. "I know," he said quietly, "and I'm prepared for that. I can't undo the person I was, but I hope I can demonstrate the person I'm trying to become." "Then let's get started," Henry said, standing and walking toward his office door. "Your first assignment is to spend a week with Maria Santos in building security. She was one of the people you treated most poorly during your time here, and she's now our head of safety operations. If Maria thinks you're ready to move forward, then we'll consider the next step." As they walked toward the elevator together, Henry reflected on the strange cycles of redemption and justice that seem to define human experience. Kyle's journey from privileged cruelty to humble service was as remarkable as Henry's own evolution from invisible janitor to visible leader. Both transformations required the kind of courage that comes only from facing uncomfortable truths about yourself and choosing to change. The elevator doors opened, and as they stepped inside, Henry noticed something that would have been impossible during Kyle's first tenure at Morrison Tower. Other employees greeted them both with genuine warmth. Not the fearful deference that Kyle had once commanded, but the authentic friendliness that flourishes in workplaces where everyone feels valued and respected. Kyle's return to Morrison Company became another chapter in the ongoing story of invisible leadership and workplace transformation. His willingness to start over, to learn humility through honest work, and to face the consequences of his past actions with grace and determination inspired employees throughout the building. But more than that, it demonstrated one of Henry's core principles, that redemption is always possible, but it must be earned through consistent action rather than grand gestures. Kyle's journey from the mailroom through various departments of the company took 2 full years, during which he learned not just the mechanics of different jobs, but the deeper lessons about dignity, respect, and the value of all work. When Kyle was finally promoted to a junior management position, it was based entirely on his merit, his character, and the recommendations of colleagues who had witnessed his transformation. The young man who had once mocked the janitor was now implementing dignity policies in his department and mentoring new employees on the importance of treating everyone with respect. As Henry approached his 70th birthday, he began to consider his legacy and the future of the movement he had helped start. The Invisible Heroes Fund had distributed millions of dollars in scholarships, small business loans, and emergency assistance to service workers throughout the city. The network of invisible owners had grown to include hundreds of hidden leaders across dozens of industries. Morrison Company had become a model of ethical business practices studied and emulated around the world. But Henry knew that the most important legacy of his journey wasn't found in financial statements or business school case studies. It was found in the daily interactions between human beings who had learned to see each other clearly, to value each other's contributions, and to treat work, all work, as dignified and important. On a quiet Sunday morning in spring, Henry sat in his apartment in Queens, sharing his traditional breakfast of eggs and coffee with Mrs. Rodriguez, who was now in her 80s but still insisted on cooking for him every week. Through his kitchen window, he could see Morrison Tower gleaming in the distance, its windows catching the morning light like a beacon. "Mijo," Mrs. Rodriguez said, as she had said countless times over the years, "you look content, like a man who has done what he came here to do." Henry smiled and nodded, understanding that contentment was indeed the right word for what he felt. Not the satisfaction that comes from accumulating wealth or achieving recognition, but the deeper peace that comes from using your life to improve the lives of others. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said, "do you remember what you used to tell me during those years when I was cleaning the building? When I came home tired and discouraged?" She chuckled, her eyes bright with the wisdom of decades. "I told you that God sees the work you do even when nobody else does. I told you that your kindness mattered even if people didn't notice it. I told you to be patient because your time would come." "You were right," Henry said simply. "About all of it, but especially about patience. The most important things take time to grow: respect, dignity, understanding, change. They can't be rushed or forced. They have to be cultivated with the same care you give to a garden." As they finished their breakfast and Mrs. Rodriguez prepared to return to her own apartment, Henry walked to his window one more time and looked out at the city that had been both his classroom and his canvas. Somewhere in those buildings were other invisible heroes: janitors, security guards, maintenance workers, food service employees, going about their work with quiet dedication, perhaps not yet knowing their own power to transform the places where they serve. Some of them might be secret owners, quietly investing their savings in the companies where they work. Others might be servant leaders, influencing their workplaces through the force of their character and the consistency of their example. All of them were part of a larger movement toward recognizing the dignity of all work and the value of every worker. Henry's story had begun with humiliation, a young executive's casual cruelty toward someone he considered beneath his notice. But it had evolved into something far more significant: a demonstration that true power comes not from the ability to make others feel small, but from the courage to help them recognize their own worth. The invisible janitor had become visible not through revenge or domination, but through service and leadership. His legacy would live on in every workplace where employees treated each other with respect, every company that valued contributions over titles, every person who chose dignity over cruelty. As the morning light streamed through his window, illuminating the simple apartment where he had carried his extraordinary secret for so many years, Henry Washington, former janitor, current CEO, and eternal believer in the invisible heroes who hold the world together, smiled with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose patient investment in human dignity had finally paid dividends beyond anything Wall Street could measure. The work continued. The invisible heroes remained at their posts, keeping the world clean and safe and running smoothly. And somewhere in the great city of New York, another person in a service uniform was watching, learning, and preparing to step into the light when the time was right. The story never truly ends. It just passes from one invisible hero to the next, each one adding their own chapter to the ongoing narrative of dignity, respect, and the quiet power of those who serve. And you, have you ever felt invisible while you were the one holding everything together? Have you ever been dismissed because of your job title while possessing wisdom that could change everything? Tell me your story in the comments below. Your experience matters, your voice deserves to be heard, and your dignity is never determined by what others think of your work. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of your own worth or inspired you to see others more clearly, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that they are valuable, that they are seen, that they matter. Every share helps us reach another invisible hero who needs to know they're not alone. For more stories that celebrate the dignity of work and the power of human decency, check out our podcast link. Thank you for walking this journey with us, for believing in the importance of treating everyone with respect, and for remembering that the most important revolutions often begin with the quiet courage of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. We'll see you in the next story, where once again we'll explore what it means to be human in a world that too often forgets to look beyond the surface. Until then, remember, you are never invisible to those who matter most, and your story, whatever it may be, has the power to change the world.